Welcome back, everybody, to part 3 of my reaction series to Teddy Roosevelt TRUSTBUSTER. If you didn't see the first 2 episodes of the series, there's a link in the description that will take you back to episode 1. As always, I also include the link to the original content creator so you can check them out, support them. They have created great content for us to use to learn, to have a discussion, and to help grow this community. So we want to make sure that we say thank you to them for all the hard work that they've put in. So please check them out and give them a like and a subscribe if you haven't already. Let's dive right into part 3.
Election night, November 8th, 1904. President Theodore Roosevelt eats dinner with his family, awaiting results. It had been a rough campaign. Conservatives in his party had planned to oust Roosevelt, this unelected radical, at the convention. And
So Mark Hanna, Mark Hanna's kind of the, if you are old enough to remember somebody like, who's the guy I'm thinking of? George W. Bush had his real famous, well-known, had to pause until I thought of it, Karl Rove. So, you know, a lot of campaigns have this very kind of visible, very outspoken, very powerful campaign managers, and Mark Hanna was William McKinley's kind of guy that ran the show for him. Hanna ends up a senator from Ohio himself. He was actually born in Lisbon, Ohio, which is like a half hour away from me. I go through there every week. So Mark Hanna, along with John D. Rockefeller, along with a lot of other really important famous people, are all buried in Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland. And I visited Mark Hanna's grave, among others. So if you want to see that, there's a link in the description that you can check out at the end of this video of my visit to Lakeview Cemetery. But yeah, Mark Hanna did not like Roosevelt. He was the total opposite of the kind of candidate that Hanna wanted to be in office, like a McKinley.
And only failed because their candidate died. Plus, with it considered unseemly to campaign while in office, because that used to be a thing, Roosevelt had to leave speeches and rallies to surrogates like William Howard Taft. Meanwhile, his Democratic opponent, Alton Parker, painted Roosevelt as erratic and owned by the trusts. Parker had even claimed that Roosevelt's campaign manager had used his former position as head of the new Bureau of Corporations to shake companies down for donations.
So isn't this interesting that the strategy, and sometimes this happens in politics, the very thing that you could least accuse him of being is what he gets accused of. There's a lot of things you might have been able to say about Theodore Roosevelt, but that he was in the pocket of big business and the trusts is not one of those things, and yet that's the accusation they use.
A lie that Parker embarrassingly retracted when Roosevelt challenged him to provide evidence. But now, the first telegrams begin to come in. It's a historic landslide, and by 9 p.m., Parker concedes. For the first time, the American people have chosen Roosevelt as their leader, and they've given him a mandate to go after the trusts. Thanks so much to Brilliant for helping us present today's historic tale. The election of 1904 was, up until that time, one of the most decisive in American history. Roosevelt won the Electoral College, 336 to 140, and captured 18.8% more of the popular vote than Parker.
Now, that doesn't look like a huge amount, but that is an absolute landslide. You know, even 55-45 is about as big a margin as you can see these days. I mean, occasionally there's more. And you can see how just like it was 40 years earlier, the strong Democratic bastion is in the South, and they're basically holding the Confederacy as it existed. Other than Kentucky and Maryland, that's the Confederacy that voted for the Democrats.
The highest popular vote margin since 1820, when Martin Van Buren ran unopposed. The only thing that hurt him was the issue of campaign contributions. Parker had pointed out that Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and other magnates had made enormous donations to Roosevelt's political campaign, implying that he had been bought out by Standard. In fact, the attack was so worrying, Roosevelt's campaign manager had even tried to get the president to decline the corporate donations and rely instead on small individual contributions from supporters. But rather than seeing money in politics as a systematic problem that needed fixing, Roosevelt interpreted the attack a slight against his honor. He preferred to keep the contributions as a way to show that no matter if Rockefeller gave $100,000 to his campaign, he was still going to pursue Standard.
So you can donate to my campaign all you want. I'm going to take your money. I'm going to win re-election, and then I'm going to turn on you anyway. Good for him.
He felt that turning away the donations would be a signal that he'd done something wrong. And now that he'd won, he'd prove how wrong Parker had been. Armed with the Sherman Antitrust Act, his new Bureau of Corporations, a progressive press stoking outrage against monopolies, and a huge popular mandate, Roosevelt was finally in position to do battle against trust abuses, just in time for an opportunity to fall right into his lap. Oil drilling had been going on in Kansas since 1860, but output was low until an independent driller hit a gusher in 1892. It was the first strike in what's now known as the Mid-Continent Field, an oil deposit eventually determined to stretch from Kansas through Oklahoma to Texas and Louisiana. Independent producers rushed in to drill, followed by Standard Oil. At first, the independents were actually happy for Standard to be there. It put up oil pipelines and arranged railroad systems to transport the oil out, as well as establishing refineries.
But we know what's going to happen, right? Standard is going to eventually see these folks as competition that needs to be destroyed. And it's happened before, but remember, when all this news broke and all this news came to America through the press about what Standard Oil had done to people and putting other people out of business and kind of running a monopoly and a trust, it was after the fact, right? These are things that had already happened. Well, now they know that Standard Oil has done those things, and now they're going to see it happening again, and it's going to be a different story this time.
But then when it controlled all of the ways to get oil out, Standard raised the transportation costs and flooded the market with cheap oil, causing independent producers that had been making over $1 a barrel to now only making around 35 cents. No one could make a profit, and they were either going out of business or headed for buyouts. So, they sounded the alarm, and Ida Tarbell showed up. To get there, she traveled by horse-drawn wagon through the worst sandstorm in decades. But when she arrived, she was greeted as something between a hero and a prophet. Hosted with parades, forced to give speeches from her hotel window, followed by reporters. It seemed she'd become the most famous woman in America. And though the crowds disturbed her writing, her celebrity meant more people approached her to tell their stories. And those stories were familiar. It seems Standard Oil was following the same playbook they'd used during the Pennsylvania oil wars of her youth.
So here's her opportunity. She can write in the press. Remember all that stuff you were outraged about a couple of years ago that Standard Oil was doing? They're doing it again. And that is going to be all Roosevelt needs to take them on.
Using secret railroad rebates and price fixing to drive competitors out, playing favorites on pipeline rates, bribing legislators to sink or blunt proposed antitrust laws, even tampering with juries. But as she wrote her article, she got a visit from James R. Garfield, the son of the former president and the current commissioner of the Bureau of Corporations. It seemed he was going down to Kansas himself to look into Standard's practices and was using Tarbell's notes as a guide. He verified every point she made, and then went back to Washington to help craft a two-pronged legal offensive against Standard.
You know, and the appearance of James R. Garfield is a great reminder that the idea of family political dynasties is not a new thing. You know, people think of the Clintons with Mr. and Mrs. Clinton, or the Kennedys, or the Bushes, these families that have multiple generations of people in government. That has been going on forever. The Garfields are a perfect example of that. And James Garfield, the President Garfield, his Secretary of War was Robert Todd Lincoln, the surviving son of Abraham Lincoln. John Adams, I think son or grandson, was Lincoln's minister to the UK at one point. William Howard Taft, his great-grandson, was the governor of Ohio a decade or so ago. So this has been going on as long as things have existed in politics. And sometime I might have to do a story, maybe a forgotten history story on Theodore Roosevelt's family, because his generations of his family continue to be very active in government. A lot of them ended up in things like the CIA, doing a lot of spy work and things like that. It's actually a really cool story to look into his grandkids, great-grandkids, and what they've done.
The first case would be based on the illegal rebates Standard had received, while the other would be a Sherman Antitrust Act suit, claiming the company was an illegal monopoly acting in restraint of trade. The illegal rebates case was the easiest to prosecute. It began in March 1907, when the government formally charged Standard Oil of Indiana with 1,903 violations of the Elkins Act, the railroad rates law Roosevelt had pushed through in 1903. There's a fun numerical coincidence. The jury found Standard guilty on all of those counts, and the judge issued a subpoena to Rockefeller, compelling him to testify about Standard's operations in order to assess the size of the penalty. U.S. Marshals fanned out from Chicago, visiting every residence Rockefeller owned. But Rockefeller had defied subpoenas before. When state courts investigating Standard served him in the past, he exploited their limited power by simply never going in person to that state. Yet the U.S. Marshals were unrelenting, trying to slip past his armed Pinkerton guards and causing him to move from house to house in secrecy. It couldn't last. July 6, 1907, Chicago. There's a crowd outside the courthouse, yelling at Rockefeller as his guards muscle their way through. The game is up, it seems. He's too old to keep running, so he's come here to testify. But with a strategy. On the stand, as the judge questions him, Rockefeller plays a semi-senile old man. He flubs basic facts, claims not to be able to remember events or details from just a few years earlier.
I don't recall. That is standard operating procedure when you don't want to admit to something, but you also don't want to perjure yourself. You just forget.
And repeats over and over that he'd stepped back from managing Standard over a decade ago. In one way, it works. John D. Rockefeller will not be going to prison. But in another way, it definitely doesn't. Because the judge decides to levy the maximum fine on every single rebated rail car. All 1,903 of them fining Standard Oil of Indiana. A whopping $29,240,000. It drew a gasp in the courtroom.
Let's put that in perspective for a second and see what that is in today's dollars. $29 million. Let's see, 1907 dollars to 20. Now, there's a lot of different ways to calculate inflation, so it's not just kind of a standard formula that you can use, but you can at least get some kind of an idea. That's $838 million today. I mean, that's basically, I don't know what the value of Standard Oil was at that time, but that's got to be a big chunk of the company.
The fine was by far the largest ever levied on an American corporation to that date. Granted, it would be appealed the next year, and a different judge eventually reversed it on a technicality. But just the fact that a judge had actually ruled against the trust, and ruled hard in more ways than one, encouraged prosecutors that they could now win in this arena. And the hits kept coming. In 1908, newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst read out a series of letters he'd obtained, where the vice president of Standard, John Archbold, sent multiple $15,000 checks to a senator and discussed antitrust legislation. Not a good look.
No, not.
Meanwhile, the Justice Department prepared its second case against Standard. It took years and 20,000 pages worth of supporting documents. But in 1909, the U.S. government sued Standard of New Jersey, the parent company of Rockefeller's empire. The Justice Department claimed that Standard was an illegal monopoly that used anti-competitive means like rebates, price fixing, undercutting, secretly operating companies claiming to be independent, and espionage against competitors to restrain trade. The U.S. government won. And when Standard appealed to the Supreme Court, the U.S. government won again in an 8-1 decision, with the one dissenter essentially saying the decision didn't go far enough. The judgment meant that Standard Oil would be broken up into 34 companies. Rockefeller got the news of the breakup by telegram while he was on the golf course with a priest.
Now, I don't know how much they'll go into this. I'm sure they will, but my understanding is that while on the surface this looked like a disastrous thing for Rockefeller, it actually is the thing that made Rockefeller the world's first billionaire. Now, a bunch of you have commented on that idea of first billionaire and said, hey, but wait a second. What about Marcus Crassus back in the Roman Empire? Or what about this person or that person? You know what? We're speaking specifically of the first person to have assets worth $1 billion. People in Rome 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago may have had the equivalent of that today, but they didn't have that much. Philip Van Rensselaer, who was married to Peggy Schuyler. If you're familiar with the Hamilton musical, Peggy was Hamilton's wife's sister. Her husband, I think it was, or maybe it was Stephen Van Rensselaer, would have probably been the richest man who ever lived if you take all of his land that he owned and equate it to today's dollars. That's not how they're calculating Rockefeller being the first billionaire. He's the first billionaire because he's the first guy that's worth $1 billion. Not in equivalent, but in real money. Equivalent today, he'd be worth like $400 billion. He'd be more than Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Warren Buffett put together. But yeah, I mean, breaking up the companies actually made him very, very wealthy.
It wasn't a surprise by then, and Standard had been preparing a game plan. Rockefeller turned to the priest and said, "If you have any money, buy stock in Standard Oil." Then he went on to shoot the best golf game of his life. And Rockefeller was right. As the breakup happened, forming 34 baby Standards, the company's stock went through the roof. And Rockefeller personally owned 25% of Standard. It quadrupled his wealth, making Rockefeller the first ever billionaire and probably at the time, the richest man on earth. And the Standard of yesterday became the companies we all know today. Standard of New Jersey became Esso, and after another merger, Exxon. Standard of New York became Mobil, Standard of California became Chevron, and Standard of Indiana became Amoco. Now, it's debatable whether this actually fostered the competition.
And it goes deeper than that. I mean, the Standard of Ohio, so Ohio is a good chunk of what is BP today. A lot of other companies can trace their roots back to these standards that were broken up.
That the government and court contended. Because though separate, the companies still maintained an old boys network and generally tried to carve up the country and stay out of each other's way. And in recent years, some like ExxonMobil have even begun to recombine, though none have the power or reach Standard did in its heyday. But though it was arguably an incomplete victory, a victory it was, and not the last. Because when Roosevelt first saw that landmark $29 million fine overturned by the courts, he realized the judicial branch could not take on the trusts alone. After all, Rockefeller and his ilk could always hire the best lawyers. No, to strike the trusts where it hurts, he would need legislation. And he knew exactly who he needed to target. The ones at the center of the illegal rebates. The railroads. Choo-choo.
Choo-choo. All right, so let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Let's continue the conversation, talking about what was going on at this time. And we'll see you again tomorrow with part 4. Thanks for watching.